Welcome to The Debate. So, in the world of romance narratives, there's this really persistent assumption that more life experience automatically equals a deeper, or I guess a heavier story.
Right, yeah. The idea that adults have all the real drama.
Exactly. We tend to think adult lives contain the actual stakes, while youth is just, a prologue. But if you look at the evolution of the boys' love genre across manga, manhwa, and international live-action series, that hierarchy gets completely inverted.
Oh, totally.
I mean, we're looking at a narrative landscape where the most seismic, earth-shattering emotional devastation doesn't actually happen in a corporate boardroom or, over a mortgage. It happens over a shared umbrella in a high school courtyard.
Which is exactly why this topic is tearing the fandom apart right now. I mean, we are looking at two fundamentally opposed philosophies of how you build a romance.
Precisely. And that clash brings us to our central question today. So, as the boys' love genre rapidly expands its emotional vocabulary, we have to ask, between school BL and adult BL, which setting actually creates the more compelling, emotionally resonant narrative framework for a love story?
It really is a defining question of the genre's current era, honestly.
Yeah, it is. So, for our discussion, I'll be arguing that school BL remains the pure emotional heart of the genre. The school setting just perfectly captures the unparalleled, breathless intensity of first love, and it intertwines that romance with the incredibly messy, high-stakes process of a character actually forming their core identity.
Right. And I will be arguing that adult BL is the genre's necessary, mature evolution. The transition to adult settings offers a much more complex storytelling architecture. It roots the romance in accumulated baggage, the brutal challenge of healthy communication, and, frankly, the weight of real-world survival stakes.
Okay, well, let's jump right into the foundational mechanics of these two settings. The absolute power of school BL, the reason it has dominated the medium for literally decades, comes down to the narrative potency of firsts.
Ah, the firsts.
Yes. Everything is happening for the very first time. The first crush, the first time you realize your feelings might deviate from the societal script, the first touch, the first devastating heartbreak.
Well, it's a strong baseline, sure, but I'd argue it's the easiest baseline to write.
Wait, I wouldn't call it easy. I call it a developmental crucible.
Think about the mechanics of a show like Semantic. You have Sang-woo, right? A character with an incredibly rigid, almost robotic operating system for a personality. When Jae-young enters his life, it's not just a romance, it's a total systemic collapse.
Because he doesn't know how to handle it.
Exactly. Because Sang-woo isn't a finished person yet, his romantic journey is inextricably linked to building his actual identity. Or, look at Sasaki and Miyano. The primary narrative tension isn't about defeating an external villain or paying off a loan.
Right.
The tension is simply Miyano trying to psychologically categorize what he's feeling. When you set a romance before adult cynicism sets in, you get to watch a character's very foundation be poured in real time.
I hear that, but I'm just not buying that the blank slate is the superior narrative engine. Yes, discovering yourself is beautiful, but adult BL fundamentally asks a much more rigorous structural question.
Which is?
It's not asking, can these two people figure out how to fall in love? It's asking, can love actually survive the brutal reality of being an adult?
But doesn't that external reality just, distract from the romance itself?
Not at all. It grounds it. Because the characters in adult BL are already fully formed, right? But they carry heavy histories. They have 15 years of psychological malware and defense mechanisms built up.
Okay, fair.
Look at a masterpiece like Old-Fashioned Cupcake. The central conflict there isn't some youthful misunderstanding in a hallway. It is the creeping, suffocating terror of being 39 years old, looking around and realizing life has quietly passed you by because you stopped taking emotional risks.
Wow, yeah.
To me, the mechanics of changing an established psychological habit in a grown man who has spent a decade building emotional walls, that is infinitely more fascinating than creating a new habit in a teenager.
I hear you, but let's talk about how those different starting points affect the actual stakes of the story. Because you mentioned the brutal reality of adulthood, but I'm going to argue that school BL actually holds the ultimate narrative stakes through sheer emotional density.
Really?
Yeah, it speaks the universal language of youth, where everything feels completely apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic to a 16-year-old. Maybe. But we're talking about narrative weight.
Exactly. And narrative weight is driven by the character's internal reality. At 16, every single decision feels like it alters the trajectory of your entire existence. If you look at Taiwanese dramas like About Youth, or Thai series like My School President, the setting operates less like an educational facility and more like a sealed narrative vacuum chamber.
A vacuum chamber? I'm going to need you to explain that one.
Yes, a vacuum chamber. Think about the physics of it. In a high school setting, you remove the gravity of paying a mortgage, the friction of career progression, and the logistics of independent survival.
Sure.
Without all those adult variables, the single molecule of romance gets to bounce around the story at hyperspeed, hitting the walls of the characters' hearts constantly. That feeling that if this boy doesn't hold my hand during the sports festival, the world will literally end. It creates a level of subjective intensity that is almost impossible to replicate once a character is distracted by a 401k or a performance review.
Okay, that is a beautifully constructed metaphor, I'll give you that. But I have to completely dismantle it. Because subjective emotional intensity is not the same thing as objective narrative consequence.
But if the character feels it's life or death, the audience feels it too.
We empathize with the heightened emotion, absolutely. But let's look at the actual physics of your vacuum chamber for a second. If a high school couple breaks up, it feels like the end of the world, sure, but it's ultimately just a teenager crying in their bedroom.
Ouch.
It is. They're going to graduate, they will go to different colleges, and they will recover. But when an adult couple falls apart or even attempts to come together, the stakes alter actual life trajectories. We are talking about the sheer exhaustion of having a boss, maintaining financial stability, and navigating real workplace prejudice.
But again, aren't those just administrative burdens? You're basically saying the stakes are just capitalism.
I'm saying the stakes are survival. Look at the structural mechanics of the new employee or step by step. These characters are navigating really rigid professional hierarchies. The power dynamics of a corporate office actively squeeze and pressure the romance.
Right.
A scandal or a messy breakup in these environments doesn't just mean a sad lunch period where your friends have to choose sides. It means losing your livelihood. It means losing your professional reputation. When a character in an adult BL decides to pursue a romance despite those massive looming threats, it makes the act of falling in love a profound act of courage. They know exactly how much gravity they are fighting, and they jump anyway.
Okay, but that exact reality and gravity you're praising is exactly what can destroy the pacing of a romance.
How so?
Well, this brings me to one of the most vital mechanics with the BL genre, the slow burn. And I will argue to the grave that the school setting is the absolute perfect, unbeatable engine for a slow burn.
Because they're stuck in a classroom together?
Yes, forced proximity is the greatest tool a romance writer has. You have assigned seating, dormitories, after-school clubs. The characters are physically forced into each other's orbit every single day, regardless of whether they are furious, embarrassed, or deeply in denial about their feelings.
Well,
It naturally stretches out the tension. Look at the brilliant pacing of a Korean BL like The Eighth Sense.
which heavily utilizes a surf club to force them together.
Exactly. The narrative traps them. And because of that trap, the longing glances, the accidental brushing of shoulders, the agonizing anticipation of a first kiss, the pacing can be excruciatingly deliberate. The emotional payoff hits like a freight train, because the structure of a school environment forces the characters to marinate in their unresolved feelings for weeks.
I see where you're going, but
Adult BL, in my observation, totally fumbles this. Because adults have cars, their own apartments, and autonomy, they can just avoid each other. Or worse, they skip right past that agonizing, beautiful phase of anticipation and jump straight into the logistics of dating.
okay, I understand the appeal of the slow burn. I do. But I really need to push back on how school BL actually achieves it.
What do you mean?
Well, anyone listening who has survived a classic school slow burn is probably thinking about the dreaded misunderstanding trope right now. How many school series stretch their narrative by relying on a massive, toxic, 5-episode misunderstanding just because a character misheard half a conversation in a hallway and ran away crying.
Look, immaturity is authentic to being a teenager. It's a feature, not a bug.
Narratively, it's a crutch. It relies on a profound, frustrating lack of basic communication to manufacture tension. What adult BL brings to the table is this structural triumph of mature communication. Shows like our dating sim or our dining table prove that you don't need toxic misunderstandings to drive a plot. Healthy boundaries and vulnerability can sustain drama beautifully.
But how? If two characters just sit down and talk out their problems like adults, where's the tension?
Because the intimacy itself becomes the narrative engine. In adult BL, intimacy isn't treated as a shocking plot device reserved for dramatic rain confession in the final 5 minutes of episode 12. It is an ongoing daily choice. Take our dining table. The sheer mechanics of sharing a meal, of domesticity, replaces the high-stakes teenage drama. We are watching two adults choose to maintain their connection, articulate their fears, and show up for each other day after day. That is incredibly compelling.
I feel like that's a massive oversimplification of how narrative tension works. If adults possess the emotional vocabulary to easily express their boundaries over a cup of coffee in episode 2, doesn't that inherently deflate the conflict for the next 10 episodes?
Not necessarily.
But conflict requires friction. If healthy communication removes the friction, doesn't adult BL risk becoming narratively flat?
That's assuming that knowing the right words is the same thing as having the courage to say them. And that is the genius of adult psychological storytelling. Let's go back to Nozu in Old Fashioned Cupcake.
Right, okay.
Nozu is incredibly articulate. He knows exactly what is happening between him and Togawa. The tension doesn't come from a lack of understanding. It comes from the absolute terror of vulnerability. He is terrified to say the words because acknowledging his desires means he has to completely dismantle the safe, comfortable, lonely life he has fiercely protected for nearly 40 decades. When an adult who has been burned by life finally lowers their shields and communicates healthfully, the emotional catharsis is massive. It's not flat, it is hard-earned.
Okay, which actually perfectly segues into my next major point. The core purpose of the boys' love genre, escapism versus real-world representation.
Right.
I strongly believe that a vast portion of the audience, and this is backed up by how fiercely protective the fandom is of these tropes, by the way, seeks out BL specifically for nostalgia and safety.
The desire to retreat into a fantasy.
Well, I wouldn't diminish it as just a retreat. The world outside is chaotic, it's heavy, and it's exhausting. When viewers tune into a show like Light on Me or read a manga like Given, they are actively seeking comforting predictability.
Sure.
They want the structural pillars of youth. They want the school festival episode where they accidentally hold hands. They want the summer beach trip. They want an idealized, pristine environment where the biggest existential threat is whether your crush likes you back.
But doesn't that stunt the genre's growth if we only ever tell stories in a sandbox?
No, it's about soothing the inner child. For a lot of the queer audience, it provides an escapist fantasy where they get to vicariously experience the golden, idealized adolescence that many were denied in their own reality. You inject the harsh realities of adult life into that, and you break the spell.
I hear that. I really do. But if the genre stays entirely trapped in this idealized teenage vacuum, it severely limits its own potential. The audience has aged alongside the genre. Queer storytelling must evolve past the locker room.
Even if it gets stressful?
Yes, because adult BL expands the genre's vocabulary by tackling real queer experiences that happen after you get your diploma.
But do we watch romance for a documentary on reality? I mean, if someone is working a 50-hour week and feeling completely crushed by corporate culture, turning on an office BL where characters are stressing about deadlines and homophobic bosses might just serve as a stressful mirror of their own daily grind. Does it strip away the very comfort that defined the genre in the first place?
It doesn't strip away the comfort. It evolves the nature of the comfort. You're assuming escapism is the only way an audience finds peace.
Isn't it?
For many adults, there is profound, deep comfort in simply feeling seen in your exhaustion. Look at a show like Cherry Magic. You have Adachi struggling with intense imposter syndrome at work,
feeling entirely invisible in his 30s. Watching him find a grand, sweeping romance, not by escaping his mundane life, but right in the middle of his soul-crushing office job, that is deeply healing. It tells the viewer, your adult life might be a grind, your career might be overwhelming, but you are still worthy of being someone's entire world. That recognition that you can be tired and still be loved is a much more enduring comfort than pretending the adult world doesn't exist.
Wow, okay. I'll admit, framing the exhaustion of adulthood as the very thing that makes the romance feel earned, that's a compelling way to look at the mechanics of those stories.
Because the genre is finally reflecting the reality of its readers and viewers. Think about manhwa like Dangerous Convenience Store or Under the Green Light. They're dealing with what it looks like to navigate power dynamics, or how to balance a budding queer relationship while dealing with the literal physical toll of aging. It proves that queer romance is vital, chaotic, and beautiful at every single stage of life, not just when you're 17.
Right. Well, as we look at the entire architecture of our discussion today, it becomes incredibly clear that we aren't just debating two different settings, we are debating entirely different physics engines for exploring the human heart.
Exactly. Different gravitational poles.
To summarize my stance in light of everything we've unpacked, I acknowledge the sophisticated, hard-earned depth that adult narratives bring to the table. However, I maintain that School BL will always remain the pure emotional anchor of the genre. By capturing the terrifying, exhilarating purity of discovering love for the very first time, it taps into a primal developmental milestone. It allows the romance to actively construct the character's core identity. By utilizing that narrative vacuum chamber, removing the friction of adult logistics and forcing proximity, it creates a perfectly sealed environment where love operates at its absolute highest, most concentrated intensity.
And while I absolutely concede the powerful, nostalgic pull of youth and the visceral thrill of those firsts, I maintain that adult BL represents the bravest, most complex form of romance. It moves past the inevitability of teenage hormones and steps into the realm of active, deliberate choice.
Right.
When adults fall in love, they are deciding that connection is worth risking a carefully built, fiercely protected life. They must navigate past traumas, dismantle decades of established habits, and utilize mature communication to bridge the gap between two fully formed histories. That structural complexity makes the emotional payoff infinitely richer, and frankly, more resonant for an audience navigating those same exact struggles.
It seems the one area where our perspectives definitively converge is a shared realization about the true magic of the boys' love genre in its current era.
Yeah, the fact that its expansion into adulthood hasn't diluted its impact, but rather massively broadened its emotional vocabulary.
Precisely. The genre has evolved into a massive, diverse landscape where audiences don't have to choose between the two. The current catalog allows us to simultaneously remember exactly where love begins in all its fragile, terrifying, identity-shaping purity and vividly imagine where it can lead decades later, bearing all the beautiful, heavy scars of a life actually lived.
It really proves that the human heart is an infinitely compelling subject, whether it's frantically learning to beat for the very first time or slowly, bravely learning how to trust again.
Which brings us back to our opening thought. Whether you prefer the raw, unblemished potential of a new foundation or the complex, time-tested architecture of a mature structure, the romance narrative proves that both hold incredible, devastating weight. There is an endless catalog of source material out there waiting to be explored, leaving it entirely up to you, the listener, to discover which philosophy of romance truly reflects your own experience. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.